Hi and welcome to NewsReal with Joe and Neil.
I'm Joe.
And I'm Neil, and today we're going to be discussing three main topics, but we'll see how it goes. Some developments in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, in the east of Ukraine. One major one that happened yesterday. We'll also be discussing the still imminent, maybe not going to happen, blow up of some kind of situation in Syria, specifically involving this chemical provocation that the Russians are adamant is due any day now. We're also going to segue into something that's it's related, but we're going to be going back in time to look at a little episode that took place in the so-called Troubles in Northern Ireland in 1994, right at the end of it, and we'll see how that ties into our overall conversation. Mm-hmm. So the first thing, obviously, is the really sad news that Aleksandr Zakharchenko, I suppose he was president, anyway, he was leader of the breakaway Donetsk People's Republic. I'm not sure if he was officially leading the Luhansk Republic as well, but in any event, he was really the chief for both of those regions. He was assassinated yesterday. Brutally blown up. Initially, they'd reported he was killed. He only died on his way to a hospital, but in fact, it seems he was killed on the spot. So at least that's one mercy. Him and a number of bodyguards, I think, were killed. One deputy was seriously injured, and maybe there were other serious injuries. It was a pre-placed bomb, they're pretty sure now, in the cafe that they were walking into.
Or outside it, I heard last.
Okay.
Like in a car right on the curb right beside it or
maybe
something.
Maybe in a car, okay.
Or vehicle.
It's obviously early to say exactly how it happened, but it was almost certainly a pre-placed bomb. You would imagine that it would have taken some kind of insider help, or we can speculate about that, but how well protected was he? You know, could you always protect against that kind of thing happening in that situation? Probably not. The guy was survivor of several previous attempts on his life. Of course, there have been a number of high-profile assassinations via bombs of other leaders of the Donbass movement, not least the two fellows by the code names GV and Motorola were killed in late 2016 and early 2017, respectively. And they were military guys. One of them at least had previous military experience in Russia. And in the 3 or 4 years they were with the Donbass militias, they would obviously have, well, who knows? We don't know to what extent they had, serious professional help from Russia directly, but let's assume they did. In any event, they could not avoid being assassinated either. It's a war zone. A lot of people have been killed. Yes, the situation there is more or less stabilized since 2015 with the Minsk Agreement 1 and Agreement 2. The bulk of the fighting all took place right up to that moment when that situation was basically stabilized. But of course, there have been incursions and attacks and reprisals since then. And notably, this trend it's kind of settling into an ugly stalemate that's all too familiar, where whatever the initial war or reason for the uprising, revolution, civil war, and so on, once there's a standoff, these situations tend to end up in this kind of tit-for-tat counterinsurgency situation where one side in particular, the Kiev side, the Ukrainian government, will inevitably have access and ways and means of infiltrating and getting close to the opposing side.
Yeah.
And it leads to a horrible situation of just pure tension.
Yeah, although I mean I think that's the limit of their scope of what they can do. Would be to plant a bomb type thing and then try and get the hell out of there type thing, because they have no, unlike other kind of counterinsurgency situations, there's no actual Ukrainian military forces or personnel on the streets patrolling. They're not occupying effectively Donbass. Okay. It hasn't got to that point yet. That could come in the future. Essentially, where Ukraine takes back, supposedly takes back Donbass and Luhansk, and then effectively it becomes an occupation from the people, from the point of view of the people in Donbass and Luhansk. It's an occupation by Kiev because they became independent. Now they've been occupied again. There's, Ukrainian military police. The locals are being treated badly, that kind of thing. And then you have a kind of an insurgency or a guerrilla war, urban warfare type thing.
Okay, it could be far worse than
that then they respond to. That then they use counterinsurgency. The Yugis would use counterinsurgency against that. But at this point, it's like, I suppose you don't want it to go there, if you know what I mean. That would be pretty bad. So Ukraine, Donbass and Luhansk are in a good position, at least from the point of view of the people in that country, and from the point of view of the Russians. They have the advantage effectively by having unilaterally declared independence, kicked out the Ukrainians, and kicked Kiev out, let's say, and they're not. They're being supported by Russia, who's kind of standing behind them effectively to provide support and defense for them. So that's a good position to be in effectively. But again, like you said earlier on, it's a stalemate really. Where does it go from there? It's just it goes nowhere. It's just it's stalled, and it can be stalled for a very long time.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to hear. I mean, if you imagine like what's like for them right now. I mean, Zakharchenko was their big man. They liked him.
Their president,
their leader, yeah,
prime minister.
There's footage of security, just police, I suppose, patrolling the area. I think it was filmed today, the morning after, and the cops are trying to do their thing and they're in tears. Like, it must be like horrific. To be going through this, but that's good to hear that. Yeah, hang on a minute. It could be a whole lot of a worse situation where you're fully occupied, maybe been deceived into whatever, coming back on the Ukrainians' fold in terms of allowing Ukraine what it wants, full control of the borders all the way around to Russia. But as long as they retain the actual physical military control of something, even if it's not even the two whole provinces, republics, it's only half of each one of them, they have something. And this will help them to dig in. I mean, they will not be trusting Kiev anytime soon, if that is indeed Kiev's wish here,
Right.
Which it gets me to my question, which is like when I first saw the news, well, that was a really stupid thing to do, because Zakharchenko, for all the vitriol Kiev will publicly, of course, say about him and throw at him, from an objective point of view, he was a very reasonable person who has successfully, for 3 years now, convinced the people that are doing the fighting and dying, and who had been dying a lot up until it stopped in 2015, to not respond to provocation after provocation and to minimize reprisals. He would make sure people who were abusing captured Kiev personnel. At one notorious case, one of his deputies had been taking prisoners of war, as they call them, from the Kiev side and torturing them in a basement somewhere. And when he found out Zakharchenko, he sent in people to have this guy arrested, and he put up a fight. And then his forces shot him in that exchange of gunfire. They killed him. So, he was as reasonable a leader you could hope to get, even if, from your perspective, this is a breakaway terrorist, as Kiev calls them, organization. Of course, they began this in 2014. They began this war, calling it an anti-terrorist operation. That's fine. You officially see it from that perspective. But you've just assassinated a relative, as hopeful and as reasonable a person as you could have hoped to be negotiating with in these circumstances.
Yeah, but this is a Kiev junta, basically, as run by Poroshenko, but really run by kind of Western politicians in Europe and particularly in the US, they're calling the shots as far as Ukraine goes, because as everybody should know, it was basically a US inspired and backed, facilitated coup that happened back in 2013. So, and that was for geopolitical reasons, effectively to try and take Ukraine away from Russia and to isolate Russia further. And it was just a very bad thing very, very bad idea from the point of view of, well, for the Ukrainian people, it was obviously a very bad idea, and Russia didn't like it either, because, Ukraine becoming wholly a kind of client state of the West was just ridiculous, given the kind of ethnic and cultural
and economic
ties that Ukraine has had for a long time with Russia. It's far more part of Russia in all those ways than it is a part of anything further to the West. So it was a situation where it should have just been left well enough alone. But of course, that's not what the Western powers do in their new Cold War against Russia. They're willing to sacrifice any number of lives in their kind of in their great game war against Russia, and to try and maintain US hegemony and to push back Russia in service to that. So, it's
the new guy who's been named as the interim leader. Don't have his name to hand. Anyway, he's issued a statement already reaffirming that their main goal, what's driving them, is accession to the Russian Federation.
Right.
So, I mean, that right there goes against your strategy if you're trying to win them back into the fold, Maybe they think they can do, they think they can kill all the leadership and force people back into the fold, and then over time they will come to accept it. But
say that again.
Well, maybe Kiev thinks it can kill all the leadership,
right,
saying these kinds of things, and finally they'll get the message.
Oh, finally they won't want to go back.
Right.
They won't want to join Russia.
Because they're running a wager here. Kiev's wager is that the new leader's statement that we, the breakaway Republic of Donbass in total, want to join the Russian Federation is a ruse, and that it's not actually the democratic will of the majority of people living there. So that's the bet. So,
or at the very least, you can break people down, or break their will, or break their spirit, where they've got where circumstances are intolerable enough that they just will give up any ideas of the price to pay for reintegration with Russia is just too high, But it's going to take a long time for the people in Donbass and Luhansk to accept the idea that they would be treated respectfully and as equal citizens in Ukraine. And it would have to be a very new Ukraine. I mean, and they had every right and every reasonable cause to break away and declare independence after that coup in 2013. It was backed by the US because they were. I mean, one of the first things that they were going to do, and which they did afterwards, was to outlaw the Russian language. Russia was effectively a second language in Ukraine up until then. And since then they basically removed that from the constitution, that Russia is no longer acceptable as a language. And what do people who speak Russian who are ethnic Russians and who speak Russian, what are they meant to think about that when that kind of a law is passed in the country? What does it suggest?
We're not welcome here.
Well, exactly. So then we'll leave. But no, you're not allowed to.
I think maybe they'd like them to leave, but without the land.
Yeah,
go and do that.
Right. Right. Which is
something like 2 million of them did.
Yeah, quite a number of them did. But at the same time, those people, as much as they're ethnic Russians and stuff, they were born and they grew up on, and their ancestors came from. A lot of them came from that part of Ukraine, which you could call it as part of Russia, effectively. So why should they move? That idea that people would just give up their land. Look, why would you fight for a piece of land? Just go somewhere else and live somewhere else. It's ridiculous. It's the kind of thing the Israelis say to the Palestinians, just leave. But why, the Palestinians just stupid, like living in an open air prison for like decades, just because they're not willing to go to,
Jordan,
50 miles away, basically, and set up home. Well, no, there's obviously something, and it's not a new thing. Obviously, it's what wars have been fought over throughout history, is an attachment people's attachment to the land and the place that they were born, the place that their parents and their grandparents, etc., came from, and this is my home, and I'm not going to go. And there's a very strong attachment to that. The idea of just becoming but if you leave immediately, you're an immigrant. Even if you go to a friendly country, it's not your country, it's not the place. Maybe they don't speak the same language that they do, and obviously in the case of Ukraine, that they speak the same language. But it's not the environment, the place that you grow up in. It's not your community, And people will fight for that. That's very important to people, and has been throughout history. So anybody but of course that's ignored. Those kind of considerations are ignored, by people who just want to see in these situations, politicians who just want those people out of there, basically, because they're a problem for me, or Palestinian problem, or our Donbass problem, Just remove them, get them out of the way. But it's not so simple, and you should know that, and you do know that if you stop and think about it. But anyway,
this move is obviously provocative. Is it terrorism for terrorism's sake, or given that Ukraine is really a zombie state with whoever's hands want to reach in and control it, feel free? I'm thinking particularly of the United States, which the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said immediately, it's almost certainly a CIA involvement in directing this. If it's a provocation, what is it to provoke?
It's to
reignite the conflict.
Yeah.
Get them fighting again.
Yeah. Of course, America loves people to fight each other. America loves it when people fight each other. So do, the Brits and many other European powers love it when countries that they have an interest in are embroiled in some kind of war, because they can stand back. Well, first of all, they make a lot of money from supplying weapons, and also they can stand back and they can help one side against another, that kind of thing. But ultimately, they stand to benefit from when they would, after the conflict kind of eventually runs its course, they stand to benefit by moving in to the ruins effectively and taking over. There's a very clear advantage there or opportunity for people with that kind of mindset to do that, and so they're very happy to start conflicts.
This situation might blow up, but that doesn't cost us anything because we've got plenty of time.
Yeah, but it doesn't cost them anything.
We'll let it play out. Yeah. We'll let it play out, and then
if it gives Russia a headache,
right?
Absolutely,
it's causing the more immediate short-term problem for Russia, because that puts pressure on Putin to do something.
Right, to focus on there to maybe move military forces to there, etc. So yeah, absolutely. That's all. I mean, the motivation you talk about means motive and opportunity. It's all right there for the Americans in terms of this guy's assassination and to reignite the conflict. I mean, America just loves it.
There's been a lot of rumors for really non-stop, but particularly since the beginning of this year, that the Kiev junta was building up forces with a view to attacking head-on, militarily attacking the breakaway republics. They haven't done that yet, but here's something. They haven't attacked in the way that everyone thought, but they have done something,
Right.
That might actually produce the same result.
Yeah.
But it's not likely, is it? Because that's...
No, you have to...
what we've been saying all these years is that all of this is done always with, at least part of it is done with a mind to provoking Putin to respond.
Right.
And what has he done?
Right.
He doesn't.
Well, he never responds the way they want him to, so...
Right.
And that's a sign of a smart person. Not necessarily a very smart person, but, someone who at least knows their enemy and has some self-control effectively, just isn't kind of a knee-jerk reactionary type person, Putin obviously sits and considers the situation and weighs up all of the options and then decides what to do based on that. It's not an emotional heat of the moment kind of a response that he engages in. So I mean, this is, in that sense, it's kind of stupid, but the problem is that it gives him there's a lot of people obviously in Donbass who would feel differently, probably, who want to speed things along and want to do something about the Ukrainians. And
if they heard us sitting here telling them, well, you just have to wait it out for a couple of decades. I'm not waiting anything out.
So that puts pressure on the Russians to do something. Pressure is put on the people in Donbass and the leadership in Donbass that then puts pressure on the Russians to do something about the situation, because I mean, you cited the videos of the policemen walking around crying and stuff at the death of Zakharchenko. So obviously it's kind of deeply felt, and it's a real blow, a real injury to them. So, And at the same time, I don't know to what extent the Russians have full control over all of the forces in Donbass, the military forces, and whether they wouldn't decide to kick something off themselves, in retaliation,
I kind of think they do, but they're just not in the way that's insinuated in Western coverage of it. I think they do, given that, as the new leader has said, our primary foreign policy goal, exactly, he said, is to join the Russian Federation. Given that voluntary, that willingness and everything, if everything is to align to that goal, it's inevitably going to mean that you're going to listen to what Moscow wants.
You have to see the big picture, basically.
Yeah.
See the long game.
Or try to.
Yeah, and that's what you're tasked with doing. I mean, it's a good kind of metaphor in a certain sense for life, where you have to, take the slings and arrows and not react, not fly off the handle, and keep on keeping on, if you know what I mean. Pick yourself back up and keep your focus on the broader goal, and not be provoked, not respond to these provocations. And that word provocation is used repeatedly by the Russians, not just in Donbass, but in Syria and other places. They accuse the Americans of engaging in provocation, deliberate provocations to try and create a situation or provoke a reaction. And but that's all. That's what they've done for decades. Like, so anybody who doesn't, at a high level, government positions among the opposition, let's say the opposition to the West, anybody who doesn't understand that shouldn't be in that position. Who doesn't understand that that's what America does, and you shouldn't respond to it. You shouldn't take the bait. Basically, you shouldn't be there. And I don't think there are many people who do that anymore. They've begun to understand the nature of the beast, let's say, and how to deal with it, at least how to contain it at the very least,
Yeah,
and keep on your path, stay the path, and keep pushing towards your goal, regardless of these attacks from the sidelines type thing.
Yeah. The other obvious thing this raises is the timing of it in relation to, you just mentioned Syria, with the tense potential provocation / advancement of the real, genuine anti-terror operation underway in that country. It's funny how they're a mirror image. Kiev has an anti-terror operation, but it's not. And Syria does, but the West won't recognize it as such. Anyway.
It's called terrorism.
Right.
The West calls anti-terrorism in Syria terrorism, and what they call terror in Ukraine they call terrorism anti-terrorism.
Yes.
Yeah, they just turn everything on its head. That's why it's difficult to navigate, People are basically told the opposite of the truth these days. Precisely the opposite of the truth.
Is this something? Is it done with a view to what's going on in Syria? Maybe they're connected.
Absolutely. You look at the broad scale kind of global picture, geopolitical picture, and you see for the past few weeks, the past couple of weeks, let's say, talk about from the Russians saying that the US's jihadist mercenary forces in Syria that have been waging this war against the Syrian government and Syrian people for 7 years, that they're planning yet another staged chemical attack to make it look like, and to blame the Syrians to allow the Americans to justify, America and their partners to justify bombing Syria again, bombing Syrian military and government infrastructure. There's been going on for a couple of weeks. It's been building up to it. It's kind of tense in a certain sense, but the Russians have pushed back quite strongly by repeatedly releasing information that this is what is going to happen, this is how it's going to happen, this is where it's going to happen. They even got to the point where they actually described that these jihadists and white helmet types, so phony aid agencies and stuff, and had abducted 40 children and were going to use them in this village to stage a chemical weapons act, where they would detonate or explode some kind of a chlorine gas bomb or something like that, and then they'd have the kids all ready for the photo opportunity. So the Russians have repeatedly released this information, sent it to the UN, and that we don't know if that has basically stayed the hand of the US. But I mean, today they even I think I saw a report today of them talking about that they also sent where they got that the Russians had evidence of them sending transporting the actual chemical weapons to the specific place, etc. So they're really doubling down on that, on trying to expose what is actually a false flag terror attack in advance. This is the reality we're in today, where, years ago, we would have talked about that idea of false flag terror attacks and you get poo-pooed as a conspiracy theorist. Mm-hmm. And today we have, at the highest level of international discourse and in the media,
yes,
you have people talking about openly, the Russians talking openly about false flag terror attacks, and talking about it as if this is just run of the mill now. This is yet another false flag terror attack, and giving evidence about how it's going to happen in advance. It just blows your mind, type of thing. If you jump back 10 or 15 years, this was all fringe talk. It was very much fringe discussion, and the idea that a false flag terror attack would ever happen, or that it even exists, or has ever happened, was just nonsense, But we're in a new reality, apparently, where it's, and it effectively it gets on CNN and the Western media, where they have to report that the Russians are saying this.
They at least have to deny it.
Yeah, they poo-poo it, but it's part of the dominant discourse these days, which is interesting. The fact that that's been going on over the past couple of weeks, leading up to a possible, the Russians have 14 ships. Naval ships in the Mediterranean, a couple of subs. They're carrying out exercises, actually, military exercises with those ships and those submarines and planes, starting today for the next 6 or 7 days, for the next week or so. And at the same time, you have US submarines and US ships arriving in the Mediterranean equipped with Tomahawk cruise missiles, apparently gearing up for another attack on Syria. So while that's all happening, you have this shooting in Donbass, the killing of the leader of the Donbass. You can't dissociate those two, from the geopolitical great game perspective. You can't dissociate those two events. I mean,
yeah. You suggested that yesterday we were talking about it. You suggested the immediate impetus for doing it. Boom. Yesterday could have been as a petty swipe back at Russia for exposing in advance, in such detail, and before the world, at the UN, directly to the White House, the details of this staged false flag attack.
I call it petty in the sense that, from my perspective, it's petty. It's a pathetic move just to kill one guy. But obviously, it's a big move to take out the leader of the Donbass, and it causes it's a pretty evil act. But it's petty in its motivation, if you know what I mean. That's what I meant when I was saying petty. It's the motivation behind it, and the people that would come up with that are just they're pathetic people. Maybe probably would have been a better word.
In their minds,
this is a great coup for them. Yeah, it's a big move. Yeah.
And on a moral plane, I bet they go, well, that's fair. I mean, you've just thwarted us with this move here
in Syria,
and so we'll thwart you with this move here. But there's a qualitative difference between the two. One of them exposed the use of 40-some children, probably killing them to make it more realistic, and then alleging that they were killed by the Syrian false flag attack. And the other one is actually killing someone. Technically, who they may not recognize, but it was a democratically elected leader of a country.
Of course. Well, Russia's goal has been to stop deaths. Stop the killing of people to the greatest extent possible, since it kind of entered into this whole game over the past, maybe up to 10 years ago.
So it's
but the Americans have precisely the opposite. America likes to start fires, and people die in fires. People die in bombings and explosions and invasions and stuff. I mean, there's no point. I don't really understand how anybody. I mean, I do understand from a psychological perspective, from a human psychology perspective, why some people disagree with that and still stick with the America's, fighting terrorism, and America's, the policeman of the world, and America's trying to keep peace, and America's trying to bestow freedom and democracy on people and stuff. I understand that people still believe that, but only from the point of view of human psychology, where people bullshit themselves to an extreme degree and have the ability to lie to themselves to a massive degree and dismiss and reject facts out of hand, regardless, because it doesn't fit with what I want to believe. That's the only way that I understand people who don't see the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation is that, of course, you go back to Iraq. America invaded Iraq because of 9/11. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and it killed 1.5 million people in Iraq. For what? For nothing. Well, obviously they did for something, but it certainly wasn't because of 9/11, because Iraq and Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. So that's one incident alone, one invasion at the very beginning of the so-called war on terror that ultimately led to the death of 1.5 million people. Is that not enough to make my case? I could cite, obviously, several other situations, in fact dozens of other situations if you want to go back before 9/11, where America has involved itself in sowing the seeds or sowing directly destruction in countries, leading to the deaths of, at this point, there's some conservative estimates of about 40 million people killed by American intervention around the world since the Second World War. I mean, if a country can be directly tied to the deaths of 40 million people, does that not, have you not made your case that that country is invested in starting fires and sowing chaos and destruction and death?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how else to convince anybody. If someone doesn't accept that fact alone, with all the details laid out, then there's nothing else to discuss. See you later. You go and you stay in your little reality bubble, and I
got a hint of the truth from one true believer when I cited that in an argument we were having about the evils or not of Soviet Russia and Communist China in decades past in the 20th century. He was saying, well, they were just pure evil. And I was saying, yes, okay, but be careful with where you go with that kind of rhetoric, because here's a basic stat, and it's the one that shows that the estimated range, a lower estimate is that 20 million people were killed by the US between 1945, so the end of the Second World War, and 1990. So that excludes the entire 21st century global war and terror period.
Oh, the 90s.
And the 90s in Yugoslavia and so on. But his response to that was simply, he dismissed it out of hand by saying, yeah, but those countries, they killed millions and millions of their own people.
But
there was ... It was left hanging in the air. He didn't flesh that out any further. But that there was some kind of flip in his mind where that was okay, therefore. If it happens abroad in the course of us trying our bestest to bring civilization to the fuzzy wuzzies, maybe they resist, too hard the great things we can give them. And that's just the inevitable casualty of civilizing this world. But that's different to this. It's psychopathic only when these places, they do it to themselves, not when we do it.
It's based on the false belief that America was interested or was motivated or was actually intending to bring freedom and democracy and civilization, whatever, to these countries. It obviously wasn't. You just have to. I mean, it's fair enough. It's understandable that people want to believe that their team is a good and great team and it's fighting for all the good and noble ideals and stuff. But you're a bit naive about human nature. You're very naive about human nature if you run with that, and you're only ever going to get a very simplistic, childish view of life and reality and the world and humanity. If you stick with that, you're never going to really understand anything. And fair enough, you're allowed to stick with that. Go ahead, but I ain't talking to you.
There have been two developments in Syria today that are tangential to the kind of poised situation that everyone's now expecting, where you've got the bulk of Syrian forces with Russian, probably weapons hot, ready to clear out what they're billing as the last terrorist stronghold in Idlib in the northwest. But is it really the last terrorist stronghold? Because look what just happened. There was an attack coming up from the south today. They were thwarted by Syrian forces still stationed there, but they ran into a bunch of this is Sputnik report here, citing
500.
The Russian Reconciliation Center, that some 300 militants attempted to capture the city of Palmyra, again in the center of the country, with a view to committing terrorist atrocities there, and that they had come up from the U.S., near the U.S. military base at Al-Tanf.
Right.
Because you remember there's that little pocket, that the blip around the border with Jordan
where the
that
US
is still controlled by the US, and the Russians have been saying, not too loudly, but between the lines, and sometimes explicitly for a year now, that Al-Tanf is right next to a Syrian refugee camp, mainly Syrians, some 60,000 still, and there's some cooperation there where they're allowed out or they're recruited and they're sent up.
Well, exactly. There's 60,000 women and children there who came from Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor.
Right.
The liberation of Deir ez-Zor. Notice my bias here: the liberation of Deir ez-Zor by the Russians and the destruction of Raqqa by the Americans.
That's the Russians have got to you.
Deir ez-Zor was significantly smaller in terms of population than Raqqa, and Raqqa was. But anyway, you have 60,000 people from these two cities in the Rukban refugee camp down on the border beside Al-Tanf, which is right beside the US military base. The US basically have control of their area, and they have access to 60,000 people, effectively, if they wanted it. And of course, you remember out of Raqqa and also out of Mosul, there was reports of ISIS, not just reports, ISIS fighters were given safe passage out of there in many buses. The question is, where do they go? Did they all end up in this refugee camp down in the south, from whence they would, from where they would, well, first they would receive some R&R, rest and recuperation, and a bit of time to get themselves back together and be facilitated to move wherever the US wanted them in Syria.
Yeah, and we absolutely know that. That's not speculation, that in every refugee camp, in every place where refugees have come from Syria, ISIS have followed.
Right.
But that's the fact. That's been proven after the case. I mean, there are court cases in Germany now involving people, and it's now known they were with ISIS and they came as a refugee, yada, yada. So absolutely it will be the same case with this camp at Al-Tanf in Jordan. But of course, the American pretext is probably, well, we're there to protect them.
Right. But this, there's a just to show you the history of this, about the possible chemical weapons attack on in Syria and Idlib. That the US is saying may be carried out by the Syrians, and the Russians have been saying, well, no, actually this is going to be a false flag provocation. It's going to be carried out by the US-backed rebels to justify the US and friends bombing Syria. There's I think it's a New York Times article, if you just throw it up there on the page. This is back, if you look at the date there, it's June 26th, 2017. The title of it is, just light up, the title of it is, Syria will pay a heavy price for another chemical attack, White House says. That's 2 months ago.
No, 2017, right?
Oh, sorry.
It's a year.
Oh, sorry. That's an example of last year's one.
Yes.
In June, one example of the kind of rhetoric coming out of the...
Yes, and that's in the aftermath of the Kane Shakun. No, the Duma one. The Duma was April 2017.
Right.
So then there's this.
Right.
Saying we'll do it again.
Yes.
Whatever, we know that.
And that led up to April
this year,
when there was allegation in Duma.
Sorry, this year was Duma.
This year was Duma. But that's just an example of how they set it up, I think. But the time frame of, it's probably about a month ago or 6 weeks ago that John Bolton, just out of the blue, said pretty much the same thing as that headline just said,
right,
which is, we will respond if... it just comes out of nowhere. They say that they've got evidence. They say they've got some evidence that, well, how they would get the evidence, nobody knows, but they say they've got evidence that the Syrian government is planning a chemical weapons attack.
No, it's a dog whistle to terrorists.
Exactly. So they come out with it, and then John Bolton said this about 6 weeks ago. So they've had 6 weeks to basically put the details in place, to plan the operation. And but like we said, the Russians have been pushing back against it. Now there's a video just from a couple of days ago of, this is the UK representative to the UN. I can't remember her name. What's her name?
Karen Pierce. By the way, she's now Dame Karen Elizabeth Pierce, appointed Dame Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George in the Queen's 2018 birthday honours.
But this is her. Let's just play that. This is her responding to a reporter's question about, well, what do you think about the Russians saying this is a provocation? And this is her justification, or her explanation of why it can't be a provocation. It must be the rebels.
Terrorist organizations in Idlib, why do you rule out that they would perpetrate such an attack?
Because this story comes from the Russians, and as I have explained, it is much more likely to be a smokescreen for things that the Syrian authorities are planning to do. The way to deal with any terrorists who are in Idlib is to ask the UN to negotiate safe passage, such as has been done before.
Do you have any sign that a chemical attack is being prepared?
We ourselves, as far as I know, do not have information about chlorine stocks being moved into the area. I find it fascinating that the Russians claim to do so, and as I say, I doubt that there is an innocent explanation for that. If it's true, it may, of course, just be a Russian smokescreen. Thank you very much.
A Russian smokescreen. If this may just be a Russian smokescreen.
So you notice that she's kind of got deep into conspiracy theory territory there, rather than accept the idea that she says they have no evidence that any chlorine is being prepared by the Syrian government. So there's no reason for them to think the Syrian government is planning any chemical weapons attack. But then because Russia says that they do have evidence, then that must mean that it's the Syrian government going to do it.
Right.
So Russia just outed the Syrian government. But Russia is at the same time claiming, obviously, that it's going to be the terrorists who are going to carry out the chemical weapons attack. But they don't buy that that's a smokescreen, and that it's actually, thanks Russia, you just told us that the Syrian government is going to do it.
And therefore you.
And notice her reason why she would dismiss it, because Russia said it.
Right.
Because Russia said that that the terrorists would carry out a chemical weapons attack, it can't be true. And also notice what she said about terrorists. This is part of the Russian or the American. Effectively, this is still part of the America's war on terror, right? And she said that the answer to this situation is to allow the terrorists safe passage. And this is from a UK Dame Numpty McFrumpty. Representing the British government, is saying that terrorists should be allowed safe passage as part of a US-UK-led war on terror? Well, when did the script change and you suddenly allow terrorists safe passage? I mean, didn't you bomb the crap out of Iraq? Because, well, I don't know why you bombed the crap out of Iraq. Well, I do know, but I don't know. The rationale didn't make any sense.
Didn't they not bomb Raqqa to remove ISIS?
Yeah.
Where was the safe passage? Well, actually, there is evidence of safe passage for some of them.
Only at the very end, though, whenever the jihadis supposedly had ensconced themselves amongst a lot of civilians, that they let them out, But in that situation, they killed obviously thousands of people in Raqqa, bombing terrorists, and now you have to let them out. Why does UK government want terrorists to be removed safely from Idlib? Why?
See, the problem is,
will we just send them to the UK or something?
The problem is these days their brains are so mushy that I'm not even sure. When I first heard that, I thought it might have been not a Freudian slip, but yes, maybe that's a classical Freudian slip where she didn't actually mean to say it like that. She meant to say, for example, give the people there, civilians, safe passage to humanitarian corridors, like in other cases before that. But terrorists got in there. I'm not even sure she meant it, because it's like John McCain when he's like, on TV, vociferously saying, I was there in a serious meeting and we all agreed we were going to fund and support ISIS. Like, it's a slip, but it's also the truth, But was our brain accidentally saying terrorists there when it should have been something else?
I don't know, but I think certainly that's the truth of the situation, and certainly they have allowed the US and its friends in Syria have facilitated the UK have facilitated the safe passage of what they called. I mean, the only mistake I think she made there was to call them terrorists as opposed to rebels. That's what she's talking about, because that's what's at issue here, is that there's up to 30,000 rebels / terrorists / nutbag jihadis, knuckle dragger jihadis, who are being paid by the Gulf states, by Saudi Arabia and by the US, and armed and trained by them in Idlib in Syria, and they don't want them bombed or killed by the Syrians and the Russians. So they want them out of there. They want to call them rebels, of course, but they're not. They're a bunch of freaking nut job terrorists, and none of this makes any sense to me. I mean, it hasn't made sense from the very beginning, but I mean, it
might make sense if we go with what she said. Ensure safe passage for the terrorists. Maybe she should have said rebels. Our favorite. The opposition fighters.
Yeah.
We want to ensure safe passage for them. But that makes sense in a way. For me, another question I had when this was brewing, I thought, well, there's no way they're going to do this again, especially now with the Russians exposing the whole thing in its details.
Well, here's what doesn't make sense to me. What doesn't make sense to me is that in a country of 26 million people, 30,000 so-called rebel fighters who...
some numbers are way higher.
Right, but left in Idlib in this situation, 30,000 of them, and who no one doubts come from many different nationalities, would be being supported by Western democracies in their so-called fight against the sovereign government of a country, of a foreign country. It's I mean, in 26 million people, 30,000 in this case is insignificant. They're basically a bunch of... If the same thing happened in America, you don't even scale it up to the numbers, you know? If, 100 or 200 or 300,000 people in America took up arms and we're going to overthrow the government, 300,000 out of 300 million. Are they representative? Is that democratic? Would you argue for the right of those people to impose their will on the vast majority of the rest? Is that what democracy is about? That's why none of it makes sense to me. It doesn't make any sense.
Yes, it doesn't.
From the Western narrative.
At that level, and also just at the basic military level, it doesn't make any sense. The momentum is with the Syrians. They can concentrate on Idlib now. They can do it in X number of weeks. Yeah. So I was thinking, well, then why on earth bother to do this? They've taken it. You may as well accept that they've taken it. Well, what if they are as concerned as she said, just with that simple immediate thing, that those 30,000 or more people that they view as a resource for future use. So they want to ensure safe passage for them to basically not lose this resource for further ends.
Of course.
At that basic economic level, it's like, well, hang on, that's ours. And so they're trying to put a delay on the operation to retake Idlib, to have a say in it, to be able to negotiate behind closed doors the safe passage of our people, our mercenaries. That's the only thing I think of, an immediate practical reason for another false flag provocation right now.
But that's absolutely the reason that they're doing it, and the reason they've done it repeatedly in the past. How the US and the UK and etc. have attempted to.
So Al Qaeda can live another day.
Yeah, to protect their interests, protect their people on the ground, their jihadis, their mercenaries on the ground that are fighting a proxy war on the behalf of the US and the UK and Syria, trying to overthrow the Syrian government. They're trying to protect their assets, right? But when I say it doesn't make sense to me, it makes sense to me at that level. But I want the government representatives to admit that, to explain why they're doing this in a way that makes sense. The way they explain it doesn't make any sense. Because she's explaining that they should allow terrorists to leave Idlib. It's like, well, that doesn't. You're representative of the UK. You're fighting a war against terrorism.
I've had to fill in the rest, but she hasn't explained herself.
Why would she? Why would the UK government want to save terrorists when they're fighting a war on terror? It doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Explain yourself. Oh, you mean you support the terrorists? Okay, well, that makes sense.
I mentioned that there were two things that happened in Syria today. One of them was a potential series of provocations that were stopped in Palmyra, in the center of the country. The other one did actually happen. There was a car bomb up in the north, right near the Turkish border. That was in the city of Azaz. I think it's only killed a couple of people. But what's odd about this one is no one has claimed responsibility for it. And it's right in the heart of territory control, technically by the Free Syrian Army, but really then with the Turks, who have taken that chunk of northern Syria. So there's this mysterious car bomb that goes off. So there's a couple of things that have happened, but away from where the focus is on Idlib. So I don't know what that pretends, but I think it's one of these things where as soon as a situation becomes fairly clear and you expect it to play out a certain way, there's something that comes in from the side, right? Which would be in keeping with the adaptive strategy of the only way you can conduct such a murky, dirty war, one where you never articulate exactly what it is you want. Because that gives away. You lose the war by doing that. As soon as you say to your British subjects or to a Western audience more generally, okay, well, yes, we support the terrorists, but listen, it's for our benefit. We'll get the oil, or at least we'll get a say in where the oil goes. We'll keep Russia back. We'll stay richer. You see, we're all in. But no, people would reject that.
Well, they would reject it, and that's where it's been said long before now that in the halls of power, basically, the way that politicians think about the population is that they're kind of simple-minded, emotionally driven people who don't really understand how the world really works. They don't have an adult understanding of the difficulties and the complexities, and sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelette type thing, and they would reject stuff ultimately that would be in their own benefit, if you know what I mean, like the British or the Americans, whoever, going around the world, conquering or colonizing countries, ultimately for the benefit, even if it's only trickle down, for the benefit of the British and the American people, And if you were to tell them what you'd have to do to go to achieve that, to go about that, to creating benefit for them, they would, in their emotionality and on their moral compass would be going a bit haywire there, and they would they would reject their government doing that, killing innocent people, etc., to achieve the goals that ultimately benefited the British people. So they understand that they have to, long before now I've understood they have to keep all that quiet, basically, keep all that silent. It has to be secrecy, basically, because people couldn't accept it. But it's for their own good, so ultimately we're tasked with doing what's in the interest of the people, which means ultimately we have to keep secrets from the people because they don't understand how messy things can get, right?
They don't understand how the world works.
Yeah, and now that's exactly.
But it's a self-fulfilling.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, if it's benefiting you, then you're going to argue for that, and you're going to stick with that worldview. You're not going to embrace a different worldview, or because that different worldview would involve maybe you not getting to be top of the pile, type of thing. So, but this goes back to the kind of childish view of the world that people have. People, if you want to understand how the world works, you have to not embrace it, but you have to at least understand it in its more complex way that actually explains what's happening much, much better and fits, maps to reality much better. This explanation, the more complex explanation, but it's not pleasant. It's not nice. It doesn't say that the world's a wonderful place and that our leaders are very good people who are always well motivated and stuff. But if you don't accept that, if you don't see the world in that way, you're never going to understand anything. You're always going to fall back on, you're going to stay in your childish view of reality, and nothing's going to make sense to you, and you're going to be scared, because you don't understand what's happening. You have no way to interpret it and understand it, so it's scary. Things just blow up and explode, and bad things happen, and you have no way to explain it. You're still stuck in, But I thought we were fighting a war on terror, and everything would be good, and why is it all gone wrong? Well, obviously there's a different explanation, that you're not understanding. You don't want to understand. So it's up to you. It's up to each person. Decide what you want to believe, But ultimately, our perspective is that it's far better to understand things as they are, warts and all, rather than live in delusion, because, well, you kind of could be setting yourself up there for problems for yourself ultimately, because you'll end up walking into situations on a belief that basically doesn't map to reality, doesn't match with reality, and you'll make mistakes. Basically, you'll be using the wrong kind of code book, I suppose, or map, let's say, to navigate the world. You'll be using the wrong map basically, and you're going to fall down a hole or walk off a cliff or something like that, as an analogy. So it's much better to get as clear and accurate a representation of what's actually going on. But the problem is that people's emotions and their desire to believe in goodness and sweetness and bunny rabbits and rainbows and unicorns, it's kind of like an injunction against that. They don't want to accept the harsh reality.
Yeah.
So it's a choice ultimately, but not an easy one. We understand, but you got to make it one way or the other.
And this is something that's hard earned. It almost has to be, nearly always has to be by direct experience, right? I mean, with people in general, individuals can learn and grow in many different ways on different tracks. But when you're looking at peoples as a whole, it seems they need to be enmeshed and exposed to this in the face on a daily basis for a period of time, which brings me to our mystery topic that I alluded to at the beginning of the show, where we're going to go back in time. But there's a current story that got us thinking about this. We have an article here. I think it's the headline with this new development. This is reported internationally, but this is the Belfast Telegraph version of it. This broke yesterday. Journalist connected to Loughin Island massacre documentary arrested. Confidential documents allegedly stolen from police ombudsman office. What's this about, Joe?
This is a story where two guys who made a documentary, effectively. One of them's called Brian McCaffrey. Give me the other name there, Scotty. Brian McCaffrey and
Trevor Burney.
Trevor Burney and Brian McCaffrey, two guys from Northern Ireland. Brian McCaffrey is a long-term kind of journalist in Northern Ireland, and Brian McCaffrey is a guy from there as well who's a documentary maker, basically. And the journalist had been investigating this, as referenced there, Loughin Island massacre for quite a long time. It happened in 1994, towards the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And it was on a night of June, I think, or July.
June 18th.
June 18th, 1994, when Ireland were playing Italy in the World Cup in America, in the Giant Stadium in America. And so small bar in this little small village, basically.
I remember that date, but I
Island.
have no idea about this.
Yeah, well, it was one of many such incidents in the previous 20 years or so. But the bar was fairly full, but it's still a very small little bar. So three guys pull up in a car outside it. One's a driver. Two guys get out. One opens the door to the bar. The other guy opens up with a machine gun, essentially, kind of like an AK-47, and shoots dead 6 people and injures a bunch of other people, all innocent people. The oldest man was 87 years old, and 5 other people were killed as well. Immediately afterwards, it was blamed on loyalist paramilitaries, or they took responsibility for the Ulster Volunteer Force, loyalist paramilitary force that had been active in Northern Ireland, fighting basically against the IRA and against the Catholic community in Northern Ireland. They're one of several groups who all were military groups who wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom and saw kind of the Catholics in Northern Ireland and their aspirations for United Ireland as a threat to their desire to remain part of the United Kingdom. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the essence of the conflict. The conflict really started back in the late 60s when civil rights marches and stuff happened. Catholics were in Northern Ireland. Catholics were second-class citizens. They were denied jobs, housing, schools, all that kind of stuff. And they marched for civil rights in the late 60s, and they were treated pretty badly by the local police force, and by these paramilitary groups kind of sprang up as well. And the IRA kind of recreated itself from kind of 60, 70 years previous when they were fighting the British in the Ireland War of Independence. They reformed, and a kind of war effectively started. It was a kind of slow-burning war with 3,000 people plus, all told, were killed. But the IRA were effectively fighting against the British forces and the local police force, which was, overwhelmingly Protestant and therefore loyal to the British government and to the United Kingdom. So these paramilitary groups were effectively used as, the loyalist paramilitary groups were used as kind of like proxy forces, in the same way the jihadis in Syria are used by America and the British to fight against the Syrians. Mm-hmm. The British government was using these loyalist Protestant paramilitary groups to fight their war, basically, for them against the IRA and against, not just fight the war, but they were also kind of keeping the war going in a certain sense, facilitating a war and stuff. There's many different reasons why they would have wanted the war to continue. Obviously, it was, one explanation was that the British were only too happy to have a kind of a live battlefield for training of their soldiers on their own territory, effectively, which is very unique, something that you would allow to go on for 30 years, So, but anyway, they used these paramilitary forces to carry out the work or the agenda of the British government in fighting against the IRA and maintaining Northern Ireland as a part of the United Kingdom. And one example was that periodically they would go and kill, indiscriminately kill Catholics, as this example in Loughlin, Ireland in 1994.
Which was a bar in like the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, bar in the middle of nowhere, basically, yeah. So, I mean, the investigation afterwards, this is just one of many different, many similar events where innocent people were shot by loyalist paramilitary forces who are effectively working for the British state, kind of indirectly in a certain sense, but because the police force in Northern Ireland, they're working for the police force. They were the first line in terms of connection with these paramilitary forces. But the police force in Northern Ireland itself was pretty much controlled by British intelligence. You had a branch of the police force called Special Branch that directly liaised with British intelligence, with MI5. So the problem with this is that, like many other similar events, there were investigations afterwards as to what actually happened. Well, there should have been an investigation immediately afterwards as to who carried out the attack. And
it should have been a slam dunk because it had been claimed as their attack by one of the loyalist forces.
One of the loyalist groups, but then you had to find out who they were, right?
Yeah.
So they had the car that they used, they had various other and DNA samples and stuff from the car, but
they found the weapons.
They found the weapon, all that kind of stuff. But as it turned out, there's been various investigations since then, in more recent years, over the past 10 or 15 years, investigations into various different attacks like these to find out what actually happened. But the upshot of this shooting was that basically no one was ever prosecuted for it. And the police basically did nothing. Like the senior investigating officer, the day after it happened, he went on holiday for 6 weeks.
Right.
And the police basically had all of this evidence. They came out later, the police had all of this evidence, but they did nothing. And they effectively knew who had carried out the shooting, and they did nothing. They didn't actually interview the person who they knew was the actual gunman for 2 months afterwards. And when they did interview him, they basically just said,
sorry to bring you in, but you have to be here for a couple of hours, right?
Yeah, you got to be here for a couple of hours. We know you're just going to say you didn't do it, so let's just have a chat. So they have a chat. But the point is, this guy is more or less an informant, or he's known to the police, basically.
Didn't they, in addition, in that interview when they had him in, officially arrested, also encourage him that you might want to select this guy as your next target?
Right, yeah, exactly.
So they were literally using investigative procedure to execute
enemies of the state, yeah. So, the details of the investigation are just ridiculous. Like, the families of the dead people never got no justice whatsoever. I mean, they've found out in later years the depth of the collusion between the police forces and the British state and these people who go around killing people, right? But examples are that when they took the guy in 2 months afterwards, the guy they knew had done the shooting. I mean, they knew in advance, basically, is this strange thing. They actually knew. They had one of their informants within this organisation had told them that these guys were planning to go and shoot this bar. That's as far as you can go. You could assume that it might have been actually the police who gave directions to go and shoot up this bar, you know what I mean? But you don't know that for sure. But certainly they knew beforehand that it was going to happen, did nothing to stop it. So then, what do you expect of a police force that knew a shooting was going to happen beforehand, didn't stop it? Do you think they're going to investigate it afterwards? It's ridiculous, They obviously didn't. When they bring him in, the shooter in 2 months after the attack, they supposedly have interview notes and stuff, but then they'd say afterwards, those interview notes were burned in an asbestos fire, defective asbestos fire in the police station, and the interview notes were burned. So we don't know what we asked him or what he was asked, but he basically wasn't accused of anything and was let go. So anyway, these guys who made this documentary, who were arrested today, the reason they were arrested, the documentary is called No Stone Unturned, and it investigates this singular shooting. Prior to the documentary, the police ombudsman, which is the police kind of oversight committee, let's say, that was looking into these kind of events, had actually said, yes, there was collusion between the police and, loyalist paramilitary death squads, basically. And there was many failings of investigations and these incidents and stuff and blah, blah. So yes, saying to the families, yes, you're right, there was collusion basically between the state forces and these people who killed your family members. But in the police ombudsman's report, he never gives any names of who the people were. So the people, and the victims, the families, the victims' families never knew who it was. They got an admission that yes, there was collusion and that there was a conspiracy involved here, but they never got to find out who did it.
And this has been common practice with all of these cases.
Right, you don't say anybody's name.
It's part of it's kind of like Northern Ireland's Truth and Reconciliation process, where, well, for starters, to have the ceasefire that led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, they agreed that anyone who would be prosecuted for anything that happened before then must be released, whatever he or she had done, within 2 years. So that immediately kept the kind of, I suppose, the baying for justice down. And in addition, when they do open up all cases to try to explain what happened,
they can get
the most they'll say is, yes, there was person A, B, C, and D, and yes, they were colluding. So
with
you're right.
Police officer A, B, C, or D.
But we're never going to name them because that would only run the risk of revenge attacks, I suppose.
Right, endanger lives.
Yeah.
So anyway, the reason these two documentary makers who made this documentary that was released last year called No Stone Unturned that investigated this shooting, the reason they were arrested yesterday and they were released then, but they were arrested because of, as the article said, they were arrested on the basis of someone had stolen a document that they had used in the documentary, and the document that they had got from the police ombudsman's office was a document that revealed the names of people who were involved and how the police knew who were involved, etc., and the evidence they had. And it turned out that the guy who had actually pulled the trigger and done the shooting, his wife had wrote a letter to a local politician after seeing him on TV, decrying the attack. Wrote a letter and said, I know who did this, and here's his name. And the reason I know that he did this is that I was involved in planning it as well, because I'm his wife. His name is Ronald Hawthorne, the guy who did the shooting, and he, his wife basically touted on him. She basically,
sold him out
to the cops, basically. But it turned out that she actually did that because he had an affair. It wasn't so much that she was concerned about the poor people who were dead, but because he had an affair.
A woman scorned.
Right, this is the kind of level of people they're talking about. So the police had this letter, and she also called. And the funny thing was that she not only wrote the letter, but she called and left a message, an anonymous phone call, leaving the message saying the same thing as in the letter to the police. But the police knew immediately from the phone call who it was, because she worked in the police canteen that she was calling. So anyway, so they knew absolutely day afterwards.
Yes.
Even the people who weren't part of the conspiracy in the police, the ones even who wouldn't have been necessarily part of it, although all of them effectively were, they all knew, all of the police force in Northern Ireland knew this had been going on for 20 years, where the police had been facilitating attacks by loyalists against Protestants, against Catholics in Northern Ireland.
And it was an intimately local affair.
Right. So these two guys were arrested because how did this document get out of the police ombudsman's office to these filmmakers to release it in their documentary? So that's what they're trying to figure out. So it's not just that they have these the names of all the people and that they published in the documentary, but also the cops now, and it's the English police actually arrested the two of them for questioning. They wanted to keep it up, overseas, if you know what I mean, back in England type of thing. They were going to handle the investigation because it was a leak, a breach of confidentiality, or a leak of documents from the police ombudsman's office. Someone in there had given these two filmmakers this document that included the woman's letter and all the names of the people involved. So, and
that's 2 years ago, though. The documentary was shown...
It was released last year, I think.
Last year, 1 year, okay. But 1 year later, they get in trouble for it.
Yeah, the police ombudsman released a report in 2016 saying everything about the names, and then they released a documentary 1 year later with the names based on this document.
And I've watched this. I think everyone will find this interesting. Obviously, it's a story about one case, but do you get a sense of how how crazy it is to have this kind of counterinsurgency situation in a place like Northern Ireland, because the filmmakers went on to try and find these people, and they found that this Ronald Hawthorne lives 4 miles.
No, not
today.
Yeah, exactly.
He lives 4 miles away from where he carried out this massacre,
Right.
and that he
And had been
was
living
involved
there.
in other massacres, and has been living there all this time. And they got some footage of him, and he and his wife still living together.
Right. The
She's-
woman who sold him to the cops. But of course, she probably knew that it wasn't a problem, because the cops weren't going to arrest him and indict him. Because
what it means is
if
that-
he went to court and sang like a canary, he'd be given all the names of the police officers and MI5 handlers and stuff who
Right.
who had been in contact with him
The-
all along.
the
I mean, the whole
premise-
thing would be blown open.
The premise then that people should not know they're killers because it might, it might create social tension and all the way up to revenge murders. Well, it's betrayed by this, because now everyone in this tiny community knows that it's your man who did it.
Right.
And there's no revenge. What got Durham police over and interested in it was that they don't want this going all the way to the top.
Exactly. But that's been the case all along with the whole historical inquiries. Historical inquiries team, it's called. There's a team of kind of lay people or civil servants, whatever, who've been investigating all these,
police.
or retired police investigating all dozens, hundreds of different shooting and killing incidents, and trying to, and in the vast majority of them, it's interesting because the vast majority of them, well, obviously the problem here is that it's all about collusion with the police, with the state forces, right? If this was just a case in Northern Ireland where you had two factions of ordinary people dissociated from the state fighting each other, that's kind of like a civil war kind of scenario, and you have no interference of the state except trying to stop it from happening.
Or maybe there is no one central state.
Right, but in this case, you had basically the problem is that you had the state fully on the side of one side in the conflict, and actually facilitating the conflict through their efforts and through their resources and stuff, and actually running. I mean, they had informants, as they call them, and this is a kind of key word, informant, where the state will basically identify a terrorist or potential, let's say, a terrorist organization or a military organization. Get a hold of one of them, either, and say, listen, you're going to jail if you don't cooperate with us. Okay, now you're our man on the inside. And, the ostensible reason, the official reason for doing that is to get someone on the inside of this organisation to take it down, to find out what they're going to do and stop the things from happening. But what the British government did was to actually put people inside these organisations, let them rise up to the top, and so that they could direct it, so they could use it to take out people that the state didn't like, wanted to kill, And even in the case of Northern Ireland, there's a good reason to think that they did it to fuel the conflict, to keep it going, to direct it, so that it was their civil war, the British government's civil war that they kept going. And that happens, obviously. The British government does that. This has applications in to modern day Islamic terrorism as well, and in both in Europe and in the US, It's kind of like a template, and that's the value of this, of all the details that have come out around the war in Northern Ireland from about 1970 until the mid-90s. The value of the amount of information that has come out to show how the state involved itself in terror attacks, and it's beyond any doubt. It's official. These are official government releases where they've had to actually go some way to showing that they're actually a functioning state, a functioning democratic state, where they have an interest in justice. And when there's evidence that there was some collusion or corruption involved in the police, it has to, justice has to be seen to be served. So, to the extent that they have allowed that information out, it's more than enough to show how the state, the British state in this case, goes about infiltrating terrorist groups and using them, when it's politically expedient, using them to further the government's own political agenda.
And specifically by committing terrorist attacks.
Right, well, if you posit that it's part of the government's, any government's agenda to sow fear and confusion, or let's say just fear and chaos periodically in a country in order to keep the people kind of enthralled to authority, to keep them manage type of thing, to keep them on a certain trajectory, you know. So even to keep a certain political party out, to keep a dominant party in power, whatever. If you posit that that's possible, that the government would have that agenda, then the way that they go about it is seen in for example, in Northern Ireland, it's seen with official documents, officially on the record, that they do actually go about it, that they have gone about it. The only thing then that you have to decide is that, for example, in the UK, with terror attacks, Islamic terror attacks, Muslim terror attacks, whatever you want to call them, in the UK or in the US, terror plots in the US, if the only thing you'd have to decide is it in the government's interest to facilitate those kind of attacks to happen? Because if you decide that there may be a case for it being in the interest of the government for those kind of terror attacks to happen, well then you have a full detailing. In the case of Northern Ireland, you have a full detailing of how they have gone about it and how they go about it, how it works.
Yeah.
The point being that Northern Ireland shows the state does not stop or does not hesitate to engage with terror groups that slaughter innocent people when it serves their political agenda. So look at other situations, look at other terror attacks that have happened over the past 15 or 20 years and come to your own conclusion as to whether or not wherever the terror attack happened, if it happened in the UK government or the French government or the American government, decide for yourself whether or not there may be some benefit somewhere in the halls of power. It may have been decided that there is benefit to the government to facilitate this terror attack. Because if you can make that hypothesis, if you can see that as plausible, then you have no problem with just slotting in how they go about it. And the fact that they have a network of kind of like informants and agents and stuff who will make these kind of terror attacks happen. It's quite complex, but there's a way to make it happen, you know, and that they have no problem with essentially killing their own people, because they have a track record of killing technically their own people in Northern Ireland over the 20 or 30 years of the conflict in Northern Ireland, you know. So it's very instructive, you know, because if you didn't have Northern Ireland, really you'd have to rely on, there's some other sources, like you could go to the kind of School of Americas in the US and Latin America and stuff about the way the US, there's evidence for the US having trained death squads that would go around killing people in South America in order to allow the local government to take reprisals, or not carry reprisals, but the death squads would be actually operating on behalf of the pro-American government in a Latin American country, taking out the opposition, basically killing politicians, killing activists, etc. They'd use death squads, and you know, School of Americas were where a lot of these individuals involved in terror groups or paramilitary groups were trained in America, sent back to South America to take out the opposition that the American government didn't like. And that's pretty much the same thing that was happening in Northern Ireland. You know, they were using terror groups, paramilitary death squad groups, to kill people that they didn't like. You know, politicians, individual activists, lawyers in some cases. The case of Pat Finucane that we've talked about previously a few years ago. And to be able to, you know, if you want to be able to take out your enemies of the state, you need to kind of have these paramilitary organizations operating, and to have them operating, you need to have a kind of a conflict happening as well for them to operate within. So you don't, there's a motivation to not to keep the conflict going. Mm-hmm. You don't have a motivation to allow peace to break out or to push forward a peace process. You have a motivation to keep the conflict going, so you can continue to take out the individuals that you don't like, in order to, and then eventually, you know, push it towards a settlement that is in your favor. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what they're trying to do in Syria, basically. You know, by trying to keep the situation going in Syria, they want to keep it going, because if a settlement were to be reached, or if they were forced to the negotiating table or a peace conference table now, the West, America and the Brits, etc., would not be in a favourable position. So they say, no, now isn't the time to stop it. We need to keep it going. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but we need to intervene in Syria. So we need to find a justification to intervene in Syria. So we need to have a phony chemical weapons attack in Syria so that we can launch Tomahawk cruise missiles to shift the balance in Syria, as I see it, towards to their benefit. So that's kind of what's going on, and like I was saying, Northern Ireland is very instructive because of the wealth of information that's available as to the fact that this went on for 25 years and the extent to which the British state forces were directly involved in colluding with, aiding and abetting terrorists to kill innocent people. I mean, it's just it's not even a conspiracy theory. It's official documents.
It's now a fact.
It's not even official documents that have been released by someone. This is official reports that have been filed publicly to great fanfare in the media by official government institutions. It's the government itself saying that it did this, and without going as far as to say, yeah, we did this in all the gory details.
Right.
But anybody who has two neurons firing can see that this is what was happening.
And it's part of the reason why it's happening is the contradiction inherent in a state like the United Kingdom, where it wishes to be seen as, and fully believes itself to be among, or if not the most democratic state in the world, the mother of all parliaments. They launched abuse non-stop at Russia and other countries for the lack of human rights, etc., etc. And so they are forced by their own narrative to allow these kinds of investigations to bring at least minimal justice,
right,
and recognition of what actually happened. Which answered the question I had, which was that, why did it's kind of tragic that it takes 2 or 3 decades for that to be acknowledged, and in the interim, far worse, probably, there is evidence for it also taking place in Iraq. Operations of this kind take place on much larger scales. I mean, so much more of the world has been ulsterized in the interim. But I suppose...
but they want 20 years or so after the fact to go by so that everybody calms down. A generation has got older that was directly involved in it. They're more, they're less likely to get worked up about it and, take vengeance, whatever. It's only the children of the people who are killed now who are really concerned and stuff, so it's enough time has gone past now that we can let this stuff out, and it's, but that's old history and let's forget about it. But the fact is, it's not old history because it's happening in Syria today.
Right.
That's the point. But that connection is never made. It's obvious to make it, but nobody ever makes it for the same reason why they cover it up for so long. It's because they don't want it to become public knowledge that Western governments engage in this kind of slaughter of innocent people for political agendas, for personal political agendas. One example I was saying to you last night after, when I grew up around this, it was known to everybody that this was what happened, that this is what was going on. I mean, you see it in the documentary. So these people basically, in 2016, so that's 22 years after the shooting, the families got the police ombudsman's report that said, yes, there was collusion between the police forces, state forces, and these terrorists who killed your family members. And they are, thank God, that's all we wanted. We just wanted the truth. We wanted someone to recognize the truth. But in the documentary, one of the wife of one of the victims said that when the next day after the shooting, she was walking outside her house, her neighbour said to her, if you want to know who did this, look no further than over there. And he pointed over at the policemen who were outside the bar, doing their investigation. So, I mean, and that's the truth of the matter, that everybody knew.
Intuitive hunch.
It wasn't even an intuitive hunch. Everybody knew it.
It was the case.
It was absolutely 100% known. I mean, because, people, Catholics in Northern Ireland grew up not just that they had animosity towards the local the police force and the state, the British state and stuff. It was that they were being treated. They knew very well from visceral personal experience that they were seen as second-class citizens, that they were looked down on by the police force, that they could get no help, no recourse from the police. If they had any problems, or whatever, that the police force were their enemy, and the police force demonstrated on a daily basis, and the British military demonstrated on a daily basis that the Catholic community in Northern Ireland were their enemy. So, and then people, there's so many different events that happen where people are being shot in the middle of the street and stuff by, like they have police roadblocks type of thing, at the end of a street, and so people are walking up a street at night time and they know there's a police roadblock that checks cars coming in and out, and they see a car coming, being let straight through the police checkpoint, and that car comes up the road and someone leans out of the back window of the car and shoots 2 people in the street, 2 innocent people. I mean, what more evidence do you need that there's collusion at that point? There's your collusion right there. So it's that kind of experience of which happened many, many times that informed that guy who said his neighbour, it's those guys over there. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a theory. It was self-evident that and everyone knew that. So it wasn't, and even the victims of the families of the victims knew as well. The ones who've been waiting on the truth all these years. They've known it from the very beginning. But they wanted an official declaration. That was the case. They
wanted the end of being treated as imbeciles for saying these conspiracy theories for so long when it's like in your face. So they get psychological relief from just hearing officialdom, and thus everyone else, those other people, the opposing side, we also must acknowledge it too.
Yeah.
But it also has the effect of, like I was saying to you earlier, the tragedy of these kinds of things that most people will only learn this by direct experience of being up against this kind of in-your-face totalitarian system. A really violent state violence, pretends it isn't, but it actually is. Everyone knows it is, but they have to pretend that it isn't, and so on. It's terrifying in itself, not just the terror that you might be killed prematurely in a horrific explosion, but the psychological terror is the key aspect of it. But what in the acknowledgement that this is what happened, and this was the environment people were living in, everyone else gets to at least hear about it, and it's good for people in Northern Ireland to know then that the British media is reporting it, and that how many people will actually pay attention to
make the connection,
or really viscerally go, whoa, and actually really see it all unfold. Very few.
Yeah, I mean, Catholics in Northern Ireland, it was absolutely transparent to them. If you're a Catholic in Northern Ireland during the 70s or 80s and into the 90s, you go and have a protest against something or other, protesting against, whatever's happening, internment or the shooting of this person or that, whatever. You go and protest down the street in your own town, and the cops and the army will come and start shooting rubber bullets at you, start shooting rubber-coated bullets, Basically, it's a very close, not, albeit nowhere near as bad, as intense, but it's pretty much the same way that the Catholic community in Northern Ireland felt the same way towards the local police and the British army and the British state as Palestinians feel towards Israel, because of what they experience on a daily basis. So,
yes, so you will naturally empathise with other people in similar situations.
Yeah, and you also understand how it works. You get a personal, a direct lesson in how it operates. You become woke, Niall.
Immunised.
Yeah,
you're immunised with key knowledge of how things are.
Yeah,
and that will be the difference between people who, like you said earlier, okay, fine, you can choose not to really understand or believe any of this and continue to believe whatever they tell you, but you will pay a price eventually.
Yeah, well, it's dangerous. Certainly, you're not saying you will pay a price, but it's a very dangerous.
Yeah, I don't mean
path to take.
You can die happily and totally unawares, but
if you're talking about a very
lacking that immunology to this
well, you're talking about you're talking about an awareness of evil in high places, and in high places being the people who rule over you. Well, and if you're then putting your faith in the fact, in the idea, in the delusion that those people are actually, no, they're not. They would never do that. They would never kill their own people. There's no one in my government who would ever countenance such an idea. If you believe the fluffy pink bunny rabbit version of it, then you are setting yourself up potentially for walking into a disaster where at some point in the future you could be on the receiving end of the evil that these people are capable of.
Yes.
And you will deny it till the last minute because you have decided that you do not want to believe that anybody in position of power and political power in Western governments would ever do such a thing. When I mean, you're talking about trusting. In certain cases, you're talking about trusting serial killers.
Well, yes, this is more specifically what I was getting at. Whatever about the more abstract thing of not getting it, that people in high places will do these kinds of things. What people in Northern Ireland and in other places around the world have learned up front and close is that the guy 4 miles down the road, now living a totally normal, integrated life, paying his taxes, running a business, doing something, and presumably therefore servicing clients of all backgrounds in the north of Ireland, was once going around getting his kicks and probably being paid for slaughtering people in the same neighborhood. It's like, I call it totalitarian because it's the psychopaths among us and other character disturbed people totally incorporated into a system that rewards them, and it exposes the existence of such people in your day-to-day reality. So whatever about the evils in high places, you understand people, the psychology of people around you. Yeah, that they are here, and that it would naturally make you cautious. It wouldn't make you distrustful necessarily of people, but maybe a healthy distrust of people, I suppose, and their real motives and what they seem like on the surface. He's such a good neighbor. He helps me with my lawn. But is he also a serial killer or inclined that way?
Well, the thing is, it doesn't preclude you from being nice and friendly to people and having good relations with people, but you have to maintain that healthy skepticism that you should have about human nature and human intentions and what lies beneath type of thing, what's really behind someone. And ultimately, unless you know the person really, really well, you can never be sure. And you can treat them nice, and you can be friends for years and all that kind of stuff. And you don't have to go around distrusting everybody and thinking everybody's out to get you or everybody's evil behind the scenes. But just know that under certain conditions, those people, you can't rely on them. Basically, you know what I mean. So only rely.
Not only that, they're a mortal threat.
Yeah, they can't. They may turn out to be under certain circumstances. So it's a general view of humanity in a certain sense. That there's no point in trying to love the whole world because there's 8 billion people. Like, are you going to get to know every single one of them? And how many of those 8 billion people are really, just in it for themselves? Ultimately, when it comes down to it, if they're in a room on their own, will they kick the dog or will they not?
Yeah.
People put up so many facades and stuff that it's just sane. As long as you've informed yourself about human nature, you've had the experiences, or you've read about it, at the very least. If you haven't had the experience, you can read about human psychology. There's plenty of books out there that'll make this pretty clear to you that people basically don't really know themselves and don't know what they're capable of, and to maintain that awareness in your everyday interactions with people, so that you don't go too far into trusting someone, beyond what's reasonable. You don't live in la la land, basically, and have this idea that we're all one and everybody's nice and all human beings have the best intentions. That's not true, It's simply not true.
And the further people get from suffering, from, I suppose, real suffering, I'm not sure how to define that exactly in this context, but the further they get from suffering, the more they are inclined to go, there is no evil in the world. Right. That's just a religious fuzzy-wuzzy thing of old.
And of course they have to
and they have to
not. Well, they also have to, when they get further from suffering and into the delusional belief of everything's, unicorns and bunny rabbits and stuff, the less likely, the more difficult it is for them to go back, basically, to go the long haul back to accepting that that's not the way things are. You know what I mean? So the further you go to one extreme, it's much more difficult to come back to the reality. So you end up just doubling down on your delusions type thing. And when you're confronted with facts that conflict with your delusions, then it's much more difficult to accept the facts. You'll just more quickly brush them aside, That's...
So anyway, people should watch that. It's called No Stone Unturned.
It's on YouTube.
It's up on YouTube. I'm not sure now how legit that is, but anyway, it's still available there. No Stone Unturned, Irish Troubles documentary, and you'll find it. So we hope you enjoyed our show, and...
Thanks for watching, and if you like the video, subscribe and like it and do all those good things, including the notification.
The bell.
The bell. It's called the bell.
Ring the bell.
Ring the bell for us.
Like
cause
good Pavlovian dogs.
Because we appreciate that, yes. So until next week, have a good whatever time of day it is, and we'll be back Another show next time.
See you soon.
See ya.
Bye, everyone.